Good evening. 30 years ago, I met the most remarkable woman in my life. Her name was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I heard her speak at a conference, and you may recognize her name or her picture because she's renowned for her work with death and dying. She was actually the catalyst for the hospice movement so that no person would ever have to die alone. But when I heard her speak, she wasn't there to speak about death and dying. Her talk was on the premise of holistic wellness. And she said, as she drew the circle up on a chart, she said, the word wellness is new to the American vernacular, but the concept of health is ageless. And she said, if you take a look at the word health, it is derived from the Anglican word which means to be whole or holy. And you can't speak about health without invoking the sense of the human spirit. And as she drew the circle, I remembered hearing and learning from my educational background that the circle is a universal symbol of wholeness. All parts come together to be whole. And in my worldly travels, and I have not seen much of the world, but I've had a great chance to see a lot of it, I noticed this to be true. This is actually an ancient headstone in Ireland that's over 2,000 years old. If you notice, there's a circle with 4 quadrants. I was in Tahiti not too long ago and noticed a petroglyph of the sacred symbol of the Polynesian culture, the turtle, once again with a circle and 4 quadrants. If you were to talk to the shamans, the sages, the wisdom keepers and the healers of all times, all cultures and languages, and ask them, what are the parts that make up the whole to be human? You would hear them say 4 things: mind, body, spirit, and emotions. These lines that separate these 4 quadrants don't exist. These lines are there for academic purposes, they're there for theoretical purposes, but you can't separate mind from body. You can't separate spirit from emotions. It's one beautiful package. And the premise of wellness or health and well-being is this, that the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. Well, in our culture, we tend to put a lot of focus on this quadrant right here because this is the most easily measurable. We can measure height and weight. We can measure blood pressure, cholesterol levels. We can even measure the DNA. We have this area down really well. But Kubler-Ross said these most prophetic words. She said, if you don't honor the integration, balance, and harmony of mind, body, spirit, and emotions, you are going to end up with dysfunction. Now, I typically say that 30 years ago, dysfunction was not commonly a used word. Today, it's our natural adjective. Well, my expertise is stress and stress management. And I was so impressed with Kubler-Ross's presentation that I went down to see her afterwards. And when it came my turn, she said to me, what's your passion in life? She didn't say, what do you do for a living? She said, what's your passion in life? And I said, everything you've been talking about. And she said, I need your help. And I said, sure, how? And she said, would you help me and people like me reintroduce the ideas of human spirituality back into health education, back into healthcare, because without it, we are in trouble. And when I said yes, I felt like I was knighted by the Queen. For the past 30 years, that's been my mission. And so the health of the human spirit is really the health of the human journey. And that's what I'm sharing with you tonight. I love this quote from Jean Chambon. She says this, we are not humans on a spiritual path. We are spirits on a human path. And I seem to have a sign on my forehead that says, please, tell me your life story, and the worse it is, the more I want to hear it. And I notice they seem to fall in 2 categories. You can have people who are victims or victors. And I've had people say to me, I've lived by all the right rules. I've done all the right things. Why did this bad thing happen to me? And if we see ourselves as humans on a spiritual path and something bad happens, we can feel like we've been punished. We can feel like we've been abandoned. But what we need to do is reverse this and see ourselves as spirits on a human path, and that means everything is open for experience, the good and the bad, and of course the ugly. And if we can learn from any and all of these experiences, then they all prove to be valuable. I often say that we come into this world like a precious gemstone, and if we can learn from these experiences, then we polish these edges so we come out looking like a beautiful polished gemstone. Well, what's the nature of stress? How much time do you have? We got lots of ground to cover here. I typically say there's 2 kinds of stress, good stress and bad stress. But for right now, let's focus on the bad stress, distress. And there's a lot of this around the world today. And the ways in which to deal with this are not just with your mind, but also with your human spirit. I love this quote that says, stress is any change you encounter in your life. And by and large, we are in times of great change right now. And by and large, people don't like change. They don't like this at all because they don't like it which they can't control. I love the expression that says, the only person who likes change is a wet baby. I love this quote. It says, stress is a perceived disconnection from our divine source. And notice the words perceived are in quotes because we are never disconnected from the divine source, whatever you conceive this to be. But if we have unresolved issues of anger and fear, this will begin to occlude our vision so we can't see well and we feel like we're cut off. So there are two emotions with stress. Okay, there's hundreds, but they fall nicely and neatly into two categories. Anger and fear. Anger is the fight response, fear is the flight response. And these are not bad emotions, they're survival emotions, but they become bad if we use them beyond the means of physical survival. They can also become a huge detriment to the human spirit because unresolved issues of anger and fear choke the human spirit. Well, I am a big fan of Joseph Campbell and his work called The Hero's Journey. I have read other people's works in the spiritual domain, and I've come up with a concept I call the seasons of the soul. And real simply, I want to put it like this. A lot of people hear the word spirituality and they think Disney World. It's the warm, fuzzy puppies. It's the sunsets. And I want you to know that so much of spirituality is subtle. It's more than just the dynamic aspects we think as being the great sunsets. So we'll leave it at that for right now, but know that there are seasons that we go through on a regular basis, and the dark night of the soul is one of those seasons. And that is where stress certainly makes itself known. I love this quote by Carl Jung, one of the founding fathers of psychology, where he said, every crisis over the age of 30 is a spiritual crisis. I think if he were alive today, he'd knock this age limit out altogether, because I know people today who are much younger than that who definitely have stressors as a spiritual crisis. But he also said this, spiritual crises require spiritual cures. And what he was talking about was what some people call inner resources. So let's take a look at some of these inner resources because they also go by the name of coping techniques. And this is just a short list up there, but they include, but not limited to, faith, humor, optimism, patience, forgiveness, and compassion. The reason why I've got the letters love in capital letters is because I believe these are all colors of love's rainbow. And to use another metaphor, I often say that these are what I call muscles of the soul. And like our physical muscles, they will never disappear, but they will atrophy if we don't use them. And so we are called upon today on a regular basis to exercise these muscles of the soul. And here's where I'd like to tell you one story of one muscle. It's the muscle of patience. This story begins with a woman named Nian Qing. She was born in China, educated in Shanghai, but then went off to England to get her college education, came back to China, and then married her childhood sweetheart. And then she went off to Australia with him because he was appointed the ambassador to Australia with Chiang Kai-shek. Mao Zedong took power, called back all the ambassadors, whereupon they were fired because they weren't communist. He was asked to take a job with Shell Oil Corporation, but died soon thereafterwards suddenly. And now Nian Qing has no means of support with a teenage daughter. But Shell Oil Corporation took the notice that she also spoke English and asked her to take her husband's place, and then she said yes. Soon after she took this position, she found a knock on her door. It was a Red Guard, Mao Zedong's Red Guard, saying, "You are under house arrest." And her first comment was, "What's my crime?" And they said, "You're a spy." And she said, "No, I'm not." And they said, "You speak English. You are a spy." She was locked under house arrest for 3 weeks and then dragged down to the #1 detention house in Shanghai, China for 6.5 years at the age of 56. If you're having a bad day, try that on for size. If you want to read a great book, I recommend her autobiography called Life and Death in Shanghai. I call her the female version of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. In this period, for 6.5 years, she was brought down to an interrogation room where she was constantly told to sign these papers to prove she was a spy or they were going to kill her. And she heard guns going off in other rooms and she knew they weren't kidding. But she also knew that if she signed these papers, they'd kill her anyway. Her brothers and sisters all had signed papers saying that she was a spy. She knew her fate was sealed. But she had one thing to read for 6.5 years in the cell, which was no bigger than the size of a walk-in closet. It was Mao's little red book. And she memorized every line in that book and would toss out a line to her persecutors enough so that they would not kill her that day. If you were to ever see her, you take a look at her wrist, you see how the scars for how deep the shackles were for 6.5 years. I had the chance to actually meet Nian Qing. She's one of my heroes. An incredible story of the triumph of the human spirit. I taught at the American University for several years, and I had students who really kind of whined a lot. They didn't know how good they had it, and I thought maybe, just maybe, if I were to bring her to class and have her tell her story, maybe they would see they have it pretty good. So I called her up out of the blue, and she said, if you come pick me up, I'll be there. She walked into class, and many students actually knew who she was. And they were just in awe of this. And she began her talk like this. In China, we have no word for stress. We call it opportunity. And then she began to tell her story of what it was like to be in prison for 6.5 years, cut off from the world, her family, everything, until she was released by the higher powers because Nixon came to China. They let her go as a token case of human rights. Well, it turns out that when she left, the first thing she wanted to do was to find out where her daughter was. She hadn't seen her daughter in 6.5 years, only to find out her daughter was killed, pushed off a building to make it look like a suicide because her daughter did not sign these papers. And as a result of this, she decided to leave the country. One of the first things she did was to actually get out of China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Canada, and then here she gave me this picture. She goes, here, put this in your slideshow. She goes, here I am on the rocks of Petra. Here she is at the age of 93, and she said to me one day, she said, you know, I think the reason why I live so long is I do Tai Chi. And I said, I think there's more going on than that. Well, one of my students said to her, Mrs. Ching, you are my hero. I can't believe you're here. You made a dream come true. How did you do it? How did you live 6.5 years in solitary confinement, cut off from the world, and still walk with grace? No animosity, no anger, with grace. And she had one word. She said patience. She said, in China, we're taught patience. I realized I had several years to practice it. So the next time you're at a traffic intersection and the person in front of you doesn't go through the yellow light, I want you to think of Nanching. The next time you're in the post office or the grocery store, the express lane, where they have a sign that says 15 items or less above your head, and there's always some guy, it's always a guy, who's got like 47 things in his basket. I want you to think of Nanching. Well, as it turns out, my last time to see her, she passed away last year, but before she did, I went to go see her, as I did every year, to take her to lunch in D.C. And I got to her front doorstep, and I knocked on the door and opened up the screen door, and she looked out and she goes, I'm so happy to see you. You just made my day. And I already kicked off my Birkenstocks. And she looked down and she goes, honey, she goes, leave those on. She goes, that's Japanese. I'm Chinese. Well, she knows I talk about her and how much I appreciate her beautiful human spirit, and she asked me to close with this, one of her favorite quotes, which she said helped her get through her time in prison. And it goes like this: human beings are like tea bags. You don't know your strength until you're put in hot water. Often credited to Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, in the terms of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, I wish you well on your journey, and I wish you a safe return home. Thank you.